Welcome to the final lecture in both our series on ethics in psychology and in our series on Unit 1, the scientific foundations of psychology. Today's lecture will take a quick look at who the major providers of ethical guidelines are and do a quick review of what role they play in how we conduct research and practice psychology more generally. My name is Chris Scull and I wrote today's lecture. Today's lecture is based on the College Board's course outline for AP Psychology version 1. Please go ahead and feel free to pause or rewind the video at any point if needed to help you take notes and to ensure that you understand the material covered. So according to the College Board, by the end of today's lecture, you should be able to describe how ethical and legal guidelines are used to protect research participants and promote sound ethical practice. In English, you should be able to understand how ethical and legal rules ground us in what is right and wrong and help to protect patients, providers, and research participants. So with that being said, ethical guidelines should be one of the first things researchers think about as they are designing their studies. Questions like, will this hurt anyone in any way, need to be hard-baked into the research design. To fail to do so is to run the serious risk of causing problems for both the researcher and the research subjects. In those ways, it should both guide the research into certain directions and away from other directions. And in so doing, it should help protect the research participants by insisting that researchers should first and foremost do no harm, that is. Ethical guidelines should also promote sound practice and do things like ensure that researchers are maintaining appropriate relationships with their research subjects and that the subjects know what is going on while it's going on, whenever possible. And if the research participants do not know what's going on while it's going on, that they find out shortly afterwards and are given an opportunity to debrief and decompress the experience, to know how the information is going to be used and what the researchers were actually trying to find out with what they did. Okay. So ethical guidelines, and when we're talking about ethical guidelines and the practice of psychology, it's worth remembering that while they cover a great many things, arguably the three most important things when we're talking about therapy are that they help the therapist and the client to develop and maintain healthy relationships based on proper boundaries, that they help guarantee the privacy of patients. Like medical doctors, psychologists are expected to not discuss clients with other people in ways that the client can be identified, and they help therapists determine the best way to treat patients. Ethical guidelines can and do change across time, particularly around what is an appropriate treatment and when it's appropriate. So if you take a treatment like, say, ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, right? It's also sometimes called shock treatments. The uses of this have changed across time, as have what are considered appropriate timeframes and dosages for treatment, right? And most people, if they think about shock treatments, think about something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is an old Jack Nicholson movie based on a Ken Kesey novel by the same name. But these days, right, it's largely used to treat folks who have serious psychological conditions like treatment-resistant depression, so their depression doesn't lift with other therapeutic approaches or drugs. But when it was first implemented, it was used to treat basically any psychological problem, anything from like a super mild schizophrenia to what would have been called at the time hysteria, right? And these are no longer considered appropriate for ECT to be used as a treatment. So instead, it's really changed what we do. In terms of who provides those guidelines, right? They come from a number of places and in a number of forms. So some of them are provided in a booklet or online, right? Some of them in the form of direct oversight with the need to approve research. The written guidelines tend to be a little broader, as they are not designed to apply to any specific situation. Thus, when you read the ones from the federal government or from the APA, they are meant to apply to all psychologists across all situations. The actual teeth to enforcement, to ensuring that, especially when we're talking about studies at least, comply with ethical standards, come down to either the Institutional Review Board or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Obviously, if you're dealing with people, you don't apply to the Animal Care Committee. But if you are dealing with animals, then you end up needing to apply to both, right? So, for example, my dad recently finished up his PsyD, that's a doctorate in psychology. And for his dissertation, which is really a fancy word for a super long research paper, he was interviewing elderly people about their current life experiences. But before he could even do the interviews, he had to apply to the Institutional Review Board for his university. So they looked at his study design, at the questions he wanted to ask, his hypothesis, And then they provided him with some feedback, and he had to actually modify his study to account for their feedback and resubmit it. Then once he resubmitted it, they read it again, and then they approved his study. And it was only after they approved his study that he was able to actually commence the interviews and then go ahead and write up the results. Right, so that's what I mean when I say that the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, actually provides the teeth, right? And if we're talking about psychological practice, then we start talking about laws and things like that, right? So after my dad was able to write up his results, that was when he finally finished up his dissertation and got his degree last spring. So we're at the end of our winding road to introduce you to psychology. So with this, our last lecture, you should have learned a bit more about ethical guidelines and about the roles that they play in research, and specifically how ethical guidelines can help psychologists to design research studies that help us learn more about the ways people think and behave, but also while doing minimal harm to the people and the animals involved in the process. Those guidelines that help us do the research are provided by a number of groups, right? The broader guidelines are provided by the APA and the federal government, and then the specific guidelines to a given situation and feedback are provided by the local institutional review board and or the institutional animal care and use committee, right? Which obviously the IACUC is when you're researching with animals. So I would like to thank you for joining me for these introductory lectures. And the rest of the year, we'll be focusing on things that are more specific, which for these early lectures, they provide the context and the background as you're learning those subsequent things. So our next unit, as I mentioned at the top of the lecture, will be on the anatomy of the brain and the nervous system. If you didn't understand any part of this lecture, or any of the other lectures, I would urge you to go back and rewatch the relevant videos or the relevant clips. If you still have questions, by all means, please feel free to bring them to class. Otherwise, I will see you in our next series of lectures.